The afternoon is quiet. The drawing room at Mayfield smells of warm bread and butter. Beneath the grey Herefordshire sky, the October garden lies brown and spent. A tea table has been laid. Scones, cakes, buttered slices. A pot of strong, good tea. Two solicitors sit in comfortable chairs across from one another. The host lifts a scone. He smiles. He hands it across. He says, screws fingers. Hello everyone. Be sure to leave a comment with where you are from and what time you're watching, and to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let us begin. 1921. The market town of Hay sits on the border between Wales and England in the county of Breconshire, threaded by the River Wye and rimmed by the Black Mountains. On that morning, the town went about its trade as it always had. Carters moving. Along Broad Street, a clock tower keeping time above the square, the smell of coal smoke drifting over tiled rooftops as autumn settled its damp hand upon the valley. In an office on Broad Street, at the practice of Cheese and Armstrong solicitors, a small and neatly dressed man prepared for a guest, Major Herbert Rowse Armstrong, 52 years old, 5 feet and 1 inch in his boots, a territorial decoration worn. With quiet pride, had written the invitation himself. He had been writing it in one form or another for several months. His rival, Oswald Martin, occupied the practice across the road. Lay a disputed property sale, a sum of money unaccounted for, and the growing unease that neither man spoke of directly. The tea was laid, the scones were warm, and the two worlds of this story, the world of a respectable man at his leisure, and the world of the law that would eventually consume him, had not yet, on that October afternoon, begun to collide. They were merely for a little while longer, moving quietly toward one another. Katherine Mary Friend was born in West Teignmouth, Devon, and married Herbert Rowse Armstrong in 1907. She was a woman of firm opinions, precise habits, and considerable energy. Those who knew her described her as capable, strong-willed, and thoroughly certain that the proper management of a household required constant vigilance. The home she kept at Mayfield, the imposing Edwardian villa in the village of Cusop Dingle, just outside Hay, was a household run by rhythm and rule. She governed her husband's comforts with equal thoroughness. Herbert was permitted to smoke in one room of the house. He was not to take alcohol unless unwell. On evenings when he might wish to linger at some social engagement, Katherine was known to remind him, sometimes in company, that it was bath night. At Mayfield, they must return home early. She was 48 years old in the spring of 1921, the mother of 3 children, Eleanora, Margaret, and young Pearson. How she understood her own marriage is not recorded. Her letters from the years of her husband's absence during the Great War speak warmly of her desire for the family to be reunited. Whatever the tensions that surrounded her in private life, she expressed in writing nothing but the wish to see her husband return safely to their children. By August of 1920, however, Katherine's health had begun to unravel in ways that alarmed those closest to her. She complained of persistent vomiting. She suffered from fevers that came and went without clear cause. She described visions. Her hands and feet grew partially paralyzed. The local physician, Dr. Thomas Hinks of Hay, attended her with growing concern, finding that she showed signs not only of physical deterioration, but of mental collapse. By the end of that summer, the decision was taken to admit Katherine to Barnwood House, a private asylum near Gloucester, where it was hoped rest and professional care might restore her to something of herself. A curious thing occurred. She improved steadily, measurably. The symptoms that had overtaken her at Mayfield receded. By January of 1921, she was considered well enough to return home. Her husband drove to Gloucester himself to bring her back. She arrived at Mayfield on the 22nd of January, 1921. She was dead exactly 1 month later. Her death was recorded by Dr. Hinks as gastritis, aggravated by heart disease and nephritis. She was buried quietly, Few attended the service. By late autumn of 1921, two worlds existed in Hay that had not yet learned to speak to one another. In one of them, a solicitor named Oswald Martin was recovering from a violent illness of uncertain origin. He had taken tea at Mayfield on the 26th of October and been seized by evening with a rapid pulse and a disorder of the stomach that his doctor found troubling. Martin's father-in-law was John Davies, the pharmacist of Hay. Davies was a methodical man and was present for the fact that Major Armstrong had purchased arsenic from his dispensary on more than one occasion. Reportedly, to treat the dandelions at Mayfield, autumn dandelions in October when nothing grows. He had also, some weeks earlier, received at the Martin household an anonymous box of chocolates. Mrs. Martin's sister-in-law had eaten from them and become exceedingly ill. The chocolates were retained. When Dr. Hinks examined the similarity between Oswald Martin's symptoms and those he had observed in the declining months of Katherine Armstrong, he was disturbed enough to contact the Home Office. The Home Office passed the matter to Scotland Yard. In the other world, Major Armstrong continued to invite Oswald Martin to further teas. The invitations came with a regularity that Martin found increasingly difficult to account for. He had accepted once. He did not intend to accept again. His health remained fragile. He declined each invitation with a quiet excuse and told no one of the arsenic found in his urine by laboratory analysis in London. Traces clear enough to leave no room for an alternative explanation. Investigators moved with deliberate care. They entered Hay only after dark, took their statements in the night hours, and withdrew before the town was fully waking. Major Armstrong was a man of standing, clerk to the justices, a churchwarden, a Freemason of the Hay Lodge, a man who had appeared before every significant court in the county. He knew judges. He knew constables. Word, if it spread, would reach him before any warrant could be drawn. The evidence assembled quietly: arsenic purchase records from Davies's pharmacy, medical notes from Dr. Hinks, analyzed samples of Martin's urine, a box of tainted chocolates, each one bearing a small nozzle hole at its base. 1921, Inspector Crutchett of Scotland Yard attended the offices of Cheese and Armstrong on Broad Street, Hay-on-Wye, to take a formal statement. Major Armstrong received him with composure. He was arrested before the afternoon was out. The record does not tell us what Katherine Armstrong knew. It does not tell us whether she understood that the return of her symptoms, so immediate upon her return to Mayfield, represented something other than the natural persistence of her illness. It does not tell us what she thought as she weakened. Again, through the first 3 weeks of February 1921, confined increasingly to her bed on the first floor of the villa, the winter light coming thin through the curtains her husband had opened on the day of her death. What the record does preserve is this: she was almost entirely paralyzed in her final days and was edged by the first of 9 years. The nurses who attended her had, some weeks before, removed sharp objects from her reach, not at her request, but as a precaution against the moments of delirium that visited her. She could not, medical evidence would later confirm, have left her bed unaided. Her final words were spoken to a nurse. She asked whether she was going to die. She said she had so much to live for. She spoke of her husband and her children. She died on the 22nd of February 1921 at 48 years of age. Her husband arrived home from his office in due course. The servants had drawn the curtains, as was the custom. Armstrong opened them again. Within weeks he was holding dinner parties at Mayfield, such as my obituary manoeuvring as the first biz, stuffed by imagining the rat, noting to friends with apparent relief that he had at last discovered a freedom that had long been absent from his domestic life. He had renewed contact with a widow named Marian Gale, whom he had met during his time stationed at Christchurch, Dorset. They discussed the possibility of marriage. A new will for Katherine was produced after her death, one in which she left everything to her husband. A will dated 1917 had divided her estate between Herbert, their children, and other relatives. Studies of the later document have since suggested it was probably in Herbert's own hand. He had not, at the time of his arrest, drawn upon his late wife's estate. At Barnwood House in Gloucester, the medical staff who had watched Katherine's steady recovery during her months of admission noted one quiet, persistent fact. She had improved entirely while away from Mayfield and had deteriorated entirely upon return. When eventually examined, they would confirm what the living woman could no longer speak to. 22. The body of Katherine Mary Armstrong was exhumed from the churchyard in which she had lain for some 10 months. The post-mortem examination was conducted by Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, pathologist to the Home Office, whose name and reputation were by that time among the most authoritative in England. Spilsbury's first observation was, in itself, remarkable. Body was preserved to a degree considerably beyond what 10 months of burial would ordinarily produce. The explanation was not in itself difficult to reach. Arsenic acts upon human tissue as a preservative. It was present in such quantity that it had in effect maintained the body far beyond the ordinary pace of decomposition. The examination of the organs confirmed what the external condition had already suggested. Spilsbury found 28 milligrams of arsenic distributed through the remains. He was careful to note for the court records that this figure represented what remained after 10 months of burial. The women had known enough from London, and that the quantity administered in life must have been considerably higher. His critical finding concerned time. The fatal dose, Spilsbury concluded, had been administered within 24 hours of death. It was not a chronic accumulation of small quantities absorbed over weeks, but had been given once in a quantity sufficient to kill on or about the 21st of February, 1921. When confronted with this conclusion alongside his own observations of Katherine's final physical condition, offered evidence to the court that would prove devastating. For Mrs. Armstrong to have administered arsenic to herself, to have risen from her bed in her paralyzed state, descended the stairs of Mayfield, located and consumed a lethal dose, was in his professional judgment absolutely impossible. If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now let us continue. Major Armstrong had been arrested on the 31st of December, 1921, by Inspector Crutchett at his offices on Broad Street. At the time of his arrest, a small packet of arsenic was found upon his person in his jacket pocket, for which no reasonable explanation was offered. Packets were discovered throughout Mayfield House. Armstrong maintained consistently that the arsenic was intended for the destruction of dandelions in the garden. 1922. Following the forensic findings from Katherine's exhumation, he was formally charged with the willful murder of his wife. The trial of Major Herbert Rowse Armstrong opened at the Shire Hall, Hereford, on the 3rd of April 1922, before Mr. Justice Darling, sitting at the Herefordshire Summer Assizes. Proceedings were followed by the press from across the British Isles and beyond. Every seat in the public gallery was occupied from the first morning. Armstrong entered a familiar setting. He had instructed counsel in this very court on previous occasions. He knew the clerk of the assizes by sight. He was known in return by nearly every officer of the court. He sat through the 10 days of evidence with his arms folded and his blue eyes steady, examining each witness with the close attention of a practicing solicitor rather than a man whose life was in the balance. He told the warders transporting him each day from Gloucester to prison that he expected an acquittal. If this case were tried in Scotland, he was reported to have said, there could be no question that not proven would be the verdict. The prosecution was led with considerable force. Archibald Bodkin presented the case for the Crown, drawing upon three interlocking pillars: the arsenic in Katherine's exhumed body, the arsenic in Oswald Martin's urine, and the quantities of arsenic found in Armstrong's possession at the moment of his arrest. Bernard Spilsbury's testimony occupied the Bayou court with a precision that left the defense little ground upon which to stand. Sir Henry Curtis Bennet, leading for the defense and among the foremost criminal barristers of the day, contended that Katherine's death was attributable to natural illness or, in the alternative, to suicide, presenting the medical notes that documented her depression and the evidence that sharp objects had been removed from her reach. He emphasized without faltering that no witness had observed Armstrong administer poison to his wife. The prosecution had not established that only Armstrong could have done what was alleged. Mr. Justice Darling's examination of Armstrong in the witness box was, by the accounts of those present, searching. Armstrong could not adequately explain the arsenic found in his pocket in December. He could not explain the individual packets in which he had stored the powder, small, portable, concealable, rather than applying it directly to his garden. The jury retired on the 13th of April, 1922. They returned in under 1 hour. Herbert Rowse Armstrong was found guilty of the murder of his wife. Mr. Justice Darling concurred with the finding and sentenced Armstrong to death. The news reached Hay on the evening of the 13th of April, 1922, and the town received it with a division of feeling that persisted for years afterward. Those who had known Armstrong, fellow Freemasons, clients of the practice, church acquaintances, found the verdict difficult to accept. It was said by some that he had been framed. It was said that the evidence pointed at jealous rivals who had conspired to destroy a prominent man. The Graphic carried detailed coverage of the proceedings on the 8th of that month, noting the great interest aroused by what it called the dramatic trial of Major Armstrong. The case was followed, in the words of one contemporary observer, as one of those murders that gave the British public a grim satisfaction in the resolution of an apparently genteel crime. Armstrong's appeals failed. On the 16th of May, the Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed his petition. The execution was set for the 31st of May, 1922. Armstrong walked to the gallows at Gloucester Prison on the appointed morning. He was 53 years old. When the prison governor asked whether he had anything to say, he replied that he was innocent of the crime for which he had been condemned to die. Executioner John Ellis later claimed that as the trap opened, Armstrong called out what sounded like, "Kitty, I'm coming to you." This cannot be confirmed with certainty. He remains to this day the only practicing solicitor in the United Kingdom ever to have been hanged for murder. His 3 children, Eleonora, Margaret, and Pearson, were given new names and placed in separate homes. They do not appear again in the public record by their original names. Mayfield, the Armstrong house at Cusop Dingle, was eventually purchased by a solicitor named Martin Beales, who took up practice at the same firm and sat, by his own account, at the very desk at which Armstrong had worked. Beales became convinced, through examination of original case files and defense documentation, that Armstrong had been innocent, that the evidence against him was circumstantial, the trial flawed, and Mr. Justice Darling's summing up improperly weighted toward conviction. His book, published as Dead Not Buried in 1995 and later retitled The Hay Poisoner, won the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger for non-fiction and reopened a debate that has not since been fully settled. In 2019, a legal review conducted for the program Murder, Mystery and My Family concluded that Mr. Justice Darling had indeed erred in law in his summing up, and that the conviction was therefore unsound. The case inspired Dorothy L. Sayers, who wove elements of it into 2 novels. In the years that followed, Anthony Berkeley Cox drew upon it in the novel Malice Aforethought. George Orwell, in his 1946 essay The Decline of the English Murder, cited it among a handful of cases that had, in his view, given the reading public of that era a peculiar and dark satisfaction. Armstrong's offices on Broad Street still stand. A brass nameplate, a desk, and a swivel chair were preserved there for decades. The firm that succeeded his continued under different names. The garden at Mayfield, where dandelions were once treated with such particular attention, grows over quietly. Whatever the truth of what passed between Katherine Armstrong and the man she married in the drawing room at the tea table, we heard, amid the period hours of keying manuscripts selected in overwhelming daily. The law said what the law said. The rope was the rope. And somewhere, beyond the reach of any inquest or appeal, Katherine Armstrong lies where she was placed, in the churchyard at the edge of a small border town, in the Black Mountains' shadow.